If he really wanted to live abroad, he could have chosen few areas more beautiful. The English countryside that has inspired poets and painters for almost 1,000 years. Oil billions guaranteed privacy, helped turn a beautiful part of southern England into an even nicer neighborhood, and converted a castle into a home. This is Sutton Place, 23 miles southeast of London in Surrey. It combines Gothic architecture with Florentine detail, and its charm is totally domestic. There was no sign here of militarism. The castle was not built to be a fortress. It was to be the home of a gentleman, and so it was for 400 years. This is where J. Paul Getty lived during the last 17 years of his life. And from here, in Renaissance splendor, that he personally, alertly, and intimately directed a model corporate industry until his death in 1976 at the age of 83. His isolation was by choice, his luxuries intentional to enrich an aging life, and his legend was being one of the world's richest men, whose fortune was estimated as high as $4 billion. But so what, he once chuckled. If my father had not come from Minnesota to the Oklahoma oil fields in the early years of the 20th century, things might have been a little different for me. But the father did come, and therefore this story of J. Paul Getty, told mainly in his own words in his last television interviews. This is how it happened, how he established an empire that would become the envy of the entire oil industry, and how he would himself become known in his own lifetime as the last tycoon of oil. This was J. Paul Getty's master bedroom. Warm, comfortable, with the look of money and the gadgets of power. About his headboard were a series of switches that kept him in continuous contact with every area of his mansion, both inside and out. And ornamenting just 3 walls were dazzling evidence of Getty's aesthetics. 4 impressionist paintings, 3 Renoirs and a Pissarro, whose combined value was $250,000. But he once said, their being there didn't make him sleep any better. What he loved about this room were the books, many in original Latin, one of the 6 languages that so embellished his mastery of culture. And he read these books often, usually early in the morning or late at night, for what he called lessons in discipline. They make you think, he said. He went to the books regularly throughout his life, and that life started far differently, not in the circumstances of art and great literature, but in the distinctly American, mud-splattered northern Oklahoma oil boomtown of Bartlesville.
Well, my father went down to Bartlesville in 1903 in connection with a lawsuit that he was settling up for an insurance company. And while he was there, he met the Carter brothers, who were oil men and who had Lot 50 in the Osage. And he purchased the lease on Lot 50 from the Carter brothers for $500 and drilled a well on it. And the well came in about 100 barrels a day, which was a substantial part of the production of Indian Territory as it was at that time. Oklahoma was the western part of what's now is Oklahoma, and the eastern part was Indian Territory. And he was one of the large producers in Indian Territory with the production from one of the one well. So you can see that it was in the pioneer days. It was an age without motor cars, very few telephones, not many electric lights. It was still the 19th century in effect, even though it was the first years of the 20th century. It was still, you felt the influence of the 19th century. And there were men that wore pistols strapped to their hips, and it was a typical frontier town in 1903 and 4. Principal hotel was the Right Way Hotel. And I, of course, a boy, 11 years old, and I enjoyed it very much. It was an adventure to me. I don't think that my parents enjoyed it that much. And we used to go down to Lot 50. It was 9 miles through the Osage. We had a pair of horses and a buggy. And we drove down there. And it was a couple-hour drive. We had to ford a river to get down there. We used to see Indians. We'd always tell it was an Indian by the number of dogs. They always had a large pack of dogs following them.
Because of oil money, Getty's education would probably be the certainly most impressive of any other early-day Oklahoma oil baron. First, University of Southern California. Then he switched to here, Magdalen College at Oxford University in England, and there promptly fell in love with Europe as well as art. Each appealed to his romance and reason. In the meantime, he was getting degrees in economics and history and trying to figure out what he was going to do with the rest of his life. The Foreign Service appealed to him slightly. He even considered a career in journalism. He had also developed great affection for travel that would stay with him throughout his life. Then World War I broke out, and in 1914, he returned to Oklahoma. He was now 21 and reluctantly entered the flourishing, rough, and fast-playing Tulsa oil boom, then almost peak. He wasn't eager to do it, but his father suggested it was time for him to go to work. The son agreed and would soon be making the sorts of moves that would characterize the next 60 years of his life.
Well, I got the bank, a local bank, to bid for me. And when I saw the bank, that was on the Stone Bluff well, Nancy Taylor. And when the crowd heard the banker bidding, they thought the bank wanted it. Most of them owed money to the bank, so they didn't bid against the bank. It gave me a good foundation for the oil business because I learned the business from the ground up. I'm a practical man. I know the nuts and bolts of the oil business.
Well, certainly your path crossed to some of the other figures that made it big in Oklahoma, later formed such great companies.
Yes.
What about Sinclair, Cosden?
Yes,
What were your impressions of those men, sir?
Well, of course, they were established successes when I met them. Harry Sinclair was a big figure. R.M. McFarland was McMahon Oil Company with Jim Chapman. And I was pretty small potatoes. compared to any of them. And I was very grateful that they'd even noticed me. Incidentally, I think I was the first man, or certainly one of the first, in Tulsa that ever wore a wristwatch. A lot of them commented the sight of the wristwatch that was rather feminine. I think it's a very important part of life. Obviously, no man can expect to have more than a limited number of opportunities. And if you fail to grasp those opportunities, nature won't make it up to you. No, I never set any target or goal for myself. I tried to return the ball as best I could.
Because of that first well at Stone Bluff, which would lead to other shrewd leases and trading, by June 1916, J. Paul Getty had his first $1 million from oil. He had been in Tulsa just 19 months, and then he promptly retired. He was 23 years old. Later in his life, Getty said, "I had enough money, and besides, I never had been too interested in having a lot of it, and I never wanted to be the leader of any pack. It was just sort of a question of faith." Anyway, he fancied early retirement, and as he had been succeeding in Tulsa against very formidable competition, his father was doing even better in the oil fields of California. Getty joined him there, but as a playboy. That lasted 2 years. Then, at the age of 25, having acquired a flamboyant sense of charm, self-confidence, style that would stay with him throughout his life, he got tired of it all, of loafing and playing, and trudged first class back into the oil fields. And it was there in California that the native Getty intelligence about oil, which seemed to run through the family, asserted itself dramatically, becoming part of the family's folklore.
About 1921, and the Union Oil Company brought in a well, a Wildcat well at Santa Fe Springs. My father was interested, and I was interested in getting some leases at Santa Fe Springs. The question was which way to go from the well, north, south, east, or west. And we hired a geologist, a very good man, to tell us. And he thought that the field lay to the east well. But my father disagreed with him. He thought the field lay to the south. And the reason for that was that my father was a very observant man, and we were going along Telegraph Avenue, and there was a heavy Santa Fe freight train which was crossing Telegraph, and it had been evidently going uphill. The land was, to the naked eye, was flat, but apparently the heavily loaded freight train going up a slight grade because the locomotive was working pretty hard. And when he got across, it started picking up speed and evidently finding it easier to pull the train. So my father said, "That's the top of the structure right there, that loaded freight train could be better than any scientific instrument to detect a slight grade. And so we bought leases around Telegraph Avenue, and that developed later as the high point in the field. And the biggest wells in the field were brought in right there. My father was a very ethical man, and I remember one time overhearing a conversation between him and a man from St. Louis. My father sold an interest in a lease to this man, and I said to him afterwards, "Don't you think you could have got more money for that interest? I think you sold it too cheap." And he said, "Well, maybe I could have got more money for the interest, but you must learn a lesson. You must learn that you mustn't make all or attempt to make all of the money in any one deal. Let the other fellow make some money. If you try to make all the money in a deal, you won't make many deals." He was a very conservative man. He didn't believe in carrying too much sail. And he also didn't believe in heavy debts. He liked to sleep nights. He didn't like to be in debt for huge sums. And I've always followed that policy in business.
This was J. Paul Getty's home in Malibu Beach, California, very close to the ocean that he loved so much and where he spent so much of his time until the 1950s. By then, almost unnoticed, Getty had become a giant of the oil industry, increasing his father's fortune after his death in 1930 and breathlessly acquiring and developing companies. There were Pacific West, Mission, Tidewater. He even got control of the Skelly Oil Company of Tulsa. There were hotels, resort areas. He owned New York's Pier Hotel. He helped develop Acapulco. There were insurance companies. He was quickly becoming one of the wealthiest men of low profile in the world. His assets were staggering. And yet his lifestyle was almost as Spartan as it had been as a child.
Have comfort. I like to stay at good hotels. I like to ride in a good car. I like to wear good clothing. I like to travel in comfort. Go first class. But that doesn't need a tremendous amount of money. And I think if you've got enough money to, so to speak, travel first class, then as Gertrude Stein would say, you've got enough money.
In the late 1950s, J. Paul Getty was on the verge of breaking a routine that had lasted for at least a decade, of living in and running his businesses from hotels all over Europe, and decided to sink his roots in England. So in 1959, he bought Sutton Place for about $1 million. 70 rooms, 14 principal bedrooms, 20 servants' rooms, 16 baths, a 140-foot ballroom, a 140-foot gallery, a great hall, 2 swimming pools, a 9-hole golf course, and 174 acres of park. It was history and legend going back to Edward the Confessor, 1,000 years. It was in this area that he spilled much of his sporting blood. It became a home in the 16th century, about 1523, a gift from Henry VIII to a court favorite and devoted subject, Sir Richard Weston. To show just how close they were, well, Anne Boleyn was a frequent guest here both before and after her loose-headed marriage to the king, and in time, her flexible nature showed itself and led to a warm and costly liaison with Sir Richard's son, Henry Weston. It cost Henry his indiscreet life. At the age of 25, he spent his last few rather melancholy days in the Tower of London, and to the very end, up until the axe fell, he stoically admitted his own guilt, but protested that Anne Boleyn was innocent. But no matter, she lost her head too. But the king's bad temper and unforgiving heart never affected his kindness toward, nor his very warm relationship with Richard Weston. Weston would continue to prosper, as would Sutton Place, and in time other members of the crown came calling with gifts and pudding and partridge and other more expensive things, and the guest lists would later extend from Elizabeth I to the Duke of Windsor. Then one day in 1959, J. Paul Getty arrived, accompanied by a financial statement that was awesomely stable.
Sutton Place was purchased as a business proposition by a subsidiary of Getty Oil Company. And it's proved to be a very good investment. I personally find it a certain hardship to live out in the country. I'd rather be in the city myself. I've always lived in the city. And it's just far enough away here from the city that friends of mine that I used to see when I was in London used to see once a week. Now I see them once every 6 weeks. And friends that I used to see once a month, now I see them once a year. I'd rather be in the city, but from the company standpoint, it's better in the country.
They built this house. It wasn't like it is nowadays. They made their own lumber. They cut down trees. They made their own bricks. And they really built the house.
Well, one gets the feeling of just absolute contentment of having an estate like this, Mr. Getty, but surely the average person has to wonder about your feelings about living here, for example, being in your study and looking out and having this sort of view. What goes through your mind?
Well, I like the view very much.
Wasn't this a hunting reserve originally by William the Conqueror?
Or it was owned by the king, and it was a hunting reserve. Mm-hmm. And there was a hunting lodge here.
Now, you've got to tell me very quickly, Mr. Getty, this story, and this might be the perfect spot to do it, that in this castle, there is the ghost of Anne Boleyn. Now,
well,
Henry...
some say so.
Well, have you ever seen it?
No, I haven't.
Has anyone else?
Well, yes, other people have.
Well, Henry VIII was a frequent visitor to this mansion, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
And Anne Boleyn?
And Queen Anne Boleyn was here, too. Mm-hmm. And some people have seen lots of ghosts here, but I haven't. A friend of mine who's a great authority on ghosts who lives near here, says that ghosts never bother the owner. They're apparently so happy that the owner is footing the bills that they don't bother him. I like walking.
Well, does it ever influence or assist your decision-making process?
I think it does. There's nothing like a good walk. Or for that matter, a good swim.
Well, is there anyone aside from you that can handle those lines?
Well, I'm probably the one that could handle them best. Teresa, 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 Teresa.
He's the one member of your organization, Mr. Getty, that won't follow orders.
Yes. Teresa.
Now, what was it you said about Nero, Mr. Getty?
Well, he's never seen the camera before, and it's upset him a little bit.
Now, you say that he would be, or Muhammad Ali would be no match for him?
I think he'd make Muhammad quit in the first round. I think Muhammad would jump out of the ring.
Besides the lions and Alsatian dogs, one other Getty passion was flowers, consonant with his devotion to beauty. At Sutton Place, there were 3 greenhouses which provided fresh flowers daily for every room in which Getty might enter on a given day. His favorite? The rose. And when he was asked what would mean more to him, creating the perfect hybrid rose or finding a flush oil field, he replied with a chuckle, an oil field, of course. Stockholders, he said, aren't that wild about roses.
I'm interested in music. I'm not fanatically interested in it, but I like a good concert. I wouldn't want to go to a concert every night, but I like to go a couple times a month.
What about books?
I'm fond of reading.
One author said that if you had put your mind to it, you could have wound up as a pretty good writer. In fact, that was your ambition once upon a time, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. But I've had more experience in writing checks than in writing books.
Do you think it's possible that the conditions economically are right in the world for another J. Paul Getty?
Well, I always have an argument with my sons. They tell me that it's impossible now to be successful in the way I was. And I take great delight in cutting out clippings of men who made great fortunes since World War II. And for instance, Mr. Perrow was here recently, paid me a visit. Very nice man, very able man. And he is reputed to have made a very big fortune in recent years, starting with very little. And of course, I pass that on to my sons, for them to digest. I think that the opportunities are still here.
Mr. Getty, do you still receive as much mail as you started receiving after Fortune wrote the article in '57 saying that you were among the world's wealthiest men?
Yes, I get literally thousands of letters from individuals wanting financial help.
Can you give us a couple of amusing examples?
Yes, they want everything from $10 to $10 million. And they seem to think that all the money I have is in cash and it's in my pocket. And it's a heavy burden. I want to get rid of it. They don't realize that all the money I have is invested in business. And people that are bigger than I am, like standard companies, Shell and Gulf, and BP, very often borrow money. Well, I'm sure they don't borrow money just to prove that they can borrow it. They're short of money. So people that are much bigger in the oil business than I am are short of money. There's no reason to doubt that I'm short of money most of the time. And I've never felt like a big businessman because I've always been in business with people that are bigger than I am. When I'm dealing, Getty Oil is dealing with Gulf, Shell, Exxon. We're dealing with bigger companies, richer companies. And when you're in that club, you don't feel particularly important. You feel like a small fella. I think men that are failures are often happier in their family life than men that's made a big success. Because women like to feel they're important. Family likes to feel it's important. If a man's always putting business first, it tells on the family. But I always figured that business was a jealous mistress. And just because it was 6 o'clock, I didn't leave my office. If there was an urgent business problem, I tried to settle the business problem before I left the office.
I wonder if you would just define the influence that beauty or culture has had on your adult years and how it's affected your life, if indeed it has.
Well, I tried to write about that once in an article I wrote called The Educated Barbarians. And I said that there were barbarians in ancient Rome who were well educated, well dressed, spoke perfect Latin, yet they were true barbarians because they had no love of art. And I think that some people miss a lot of life because they have that same barbarian streak in them. One time I was motoring in Rome with an American businessman, friend of mine. And he made the remark as we went through the forum, wouldn't it be nice if they tore down all these old buildings here and clutter up the scenery and put some nice modern buildings there? Well, what are you going to do with somebody that has an attitude like that? And yet, it's very true today. There's hardly an old building in the world that somebody doesn't want to tear it down. There's an instinct to tear it down. And an old tree, people want to tear it down. They've always got some reason why it should be cut down. I would rather keep the old tree and the old building.
Next to art, and it was always second in his priorities, Getty's total life was business, searching for oil and lots of it, and usually being the first man in new fields to find it.
Well, I had been interested in getting property in the Middle East ever since 1932, but I'd never been successful in getting anything until 1949, when in February 1949, I was able to get the neutral zone, the Saudi half interest in the neutral zone. And I had great faith in it. But unfortunately, the first 2 years were full of disappointments because we weren't in the right part as events showed. And we got nothing but dry holes. Well, I've been fearing an energy crisis since 1920. There was an energy crisis in 1920. I sold oil as high as $5.25 a barrel in 1920. And I've been fooled every time. Somehow or other, the higher prices have brought about a flood of oil. And it could happen this time, that 3 or 4 years from now, oil might be in abundant supply. But I doubt it this time. I think that there's always the last time that the pitcher goes to the well, it finally gets broken. I don't know why some people make more money than others do. I don't know the rules of selection. I know in politics, I've seen people that I thought would be very good vote getters and very accomplished, very personable, very good speakers. And yet they never got elected to anything more important than the town council, the board of aldermen, and why one person is elected president of the United States, a governor of the state, a prime minister. Another person never gets beyond being part of the city council. I don't know. There must be some reason for it, but I think that that's one thing you don't learn in school.
The huge profits from oil allowed Getty to indulge one great concession to antiquity. He loved ancient Rome, ancient Greece, and wanted to satisfy that delight by honoring that period of history in art. He would have to buy. He would have to know what to buy. Then he would have to decide how to arrange it for exhibition, what kind of museum to build, and where to build the museum.
I thought that I would build a villa in Malibu to display works of art. And I felt that there was so much modern architecture in the world that I would copy an ancient building, and that it might be interesting not only as a museum to show art collections, but in itself as an example of ancient architecture. The Villa, the Papyri at Herculaneum, had always been of interest to me. And I did my best to reproduce it as far as we know. We don't have complete information about the ancient villa, although we have a very good engineering drawing of the peristyle garden and the floor plan of the villa. So I think that we had so much ancient architecture in the world 2,000 years ago, and it's a shame that practically nothing is existing today. There's a Pantheon in Rome and the Colosseum in Rome, but you could say that 99.99% of the ancient buildings no longer exist. You could also say that you go to Pompeii and Herculaneum, you can see it the way it is now, and you go to Malibu and see the way it was. The villa was built in the palmy days of imperial Rome, and I think it carries a message to moderns. And the collection there is Greek and Roman statues are in keeping with the villa. The Renaissance paintings and French decorative art are upstairs, and I think they're worthy of seeing. I don't feel there's any clash between the ground floor and the upper floor. I hope that people who visit the villa absorb some of the atmosphere there that dates back to the classical age.
Overall, though, you're somewhat pleased with the direction that your life has taken.
Yes.
Do you consider it a success?
Well, I can say that I've been surprised. I never expected to be unduly wealthy.
J. Paul Getty died on June 6, 1976. And just a few months earlier had said that although he would have little to say about it probably, he would like to be remembered as a man of culture who loved art and wanted to share it with others. And that, if given a choice, he would also want to be remembered as a businessman who had created a great oil company.
He was a very shrewd, smart businessman. He recognized a good deal when he saw one. He had that inner feeling of when a deal was a good deal, that he He could recognize it when a lot of other people might not have recognized it. He was a hard-headed businessman. He drove a hard bargain. But at the same time, he was a very ethical man. I think that he would have never, in my knowledge, and I'm sure it's true, he would never take unfair advantage of anyone.
For the last quarter century of his life, J. Paul Getty lived in Europe. He never even saw his beloved museum at Malibu. But he would talk of it often, always promising that one day soon he would return to California, that he considered himself abroad just a visitor, really, no more. California was home. He would also speak reverently of the roar of the California surf, and would say on occasion, you know, I should have been a beachcomber, and I bet I could have been one of the best. Coming from a man with $4 billion, it was hard to disagree that he would have done that just as well, if not better, than anyone else, for that was the pattern of his remarkable life.